Guys, so let's get started with Unit 4, Topic 6, Internal and External Challenges to State Power in 1450 to 1750. Now, one of the things I want you to keep in mind is a question whether the rebellions and challenges that we talk about are internal challenges or internal resistance, or are they external challenges or external resistance? In other words, do they come from inside the colony or inside the empire, or are they coming from outside the empire? Okay, so keep those things in mind as we go along. Now, your learning objective for today in this unit is going to be to explain the effects of the development of state power from 1450 to 1750. So we're going to talk about not only state expansion and centralization that leads to resistance from different social, political, or economic groups on a local level from the people who already live in these colonies or within these empires, but we'll also talk about enslaved persons who challenge existing authority in the Americas through organized resistance. So not only are we going to see resistance come from people who are either indigenous to these territories or even people who live in these colonies, but also people who've been brought to these colonies to work, so the enslaved Africans as well. So we'll take a look at both of those types as we go along, all right? Now, the first thing in your notes here, you have a map. You can pause if you need to fill in the names of these different rebellions and resistances that we will talk about. This is not necessarily a whole list, right? This is not all encompassing. These are some of the ones that we are going to talk about. The Pueblo Revolt in southwestern, what is now the southwestern part of the United States, the Fronde civil disturbances in France, which will kind of set us up for the French Revolution, next unit, the Cossack Rebellion, the Zinga's resistance here in Africa. We're going to talk about all of these in detail, so you can pause if you need to write these down, but the only one that we will not really touch on in this section is going to be the rebellion of Tupac Amaru with the Inca against the Spanish. Now, we list it here because it does sort of fit the context of resistance to state building and resistance to empire, but we're actually going to talk about it a little bit more when we get into revolutions themselves in Unit 5. So we'll put it on the list here, but again, we're going to touch on it a little bit more in detail in the next unit altogether. Okay. So, reminder here of the Dutch and Portuguese War that we talked about in the last section. Portugal is sort of forced out of Southeast Asia by the Dutch and the English, so they are going to set their attention here on Africa, setting up a colony in Africa. Of course, they've got their trading posts in Morocco, they've got their trading posts in India, they've got their colony going in Brazil, in South America, but they're going to set their sights on setting up a full-fledged colony here in Africa. So that is going to be the kind of the focus, and that's kind of where we're going to get a start, because they do have a foothold, they do have a trading post in Africa, but they're going to try to set up a colony in sort of that central west part of Africa. Okay, so that brings us to this first set of resistance, and I'm covering the girl's face here, so I'm going to move myself a little bit. But the Portuguese, right, set up that trading post in Luanda, Ndongo in 1575. They sort of become allies with a neighboring kingdom, the Kingdom of Congo, and would go on to wage sort of a set of brutal war from 1575 to roughly 1580, right? The mid 1580s, so about 5 to 10 years of war, brutal war, where they would burn villages completely to the ground, right? Set up forts to really control the slave trade. That is the goal here of this colony. This colony is not to sort of set up Portugal to integrate itself into African society, to be friends or neighbors with the Africans who live there. Their goal is to set up this colony and take advantage of the resource of the slave trade. Okay. Now, in 1590, right, the Ndongo kingdom would finally defeat the Portuguese. Okay, so lots of war happening, lots of fighting happening. But the kingdom itself, the kingdom of Ndongo, was devastated. Politically devastated, economically devastated by years of constant war. Now, the Portuguese would start to come back in 1621. So 1590, Ndongo defeats the Portuguese sort of reset, come back in 1621, and that's when the king of Ndongo would set up with his sister, Ana Nzinga, would ask her to make peace with the Portuguese, and she would make an agreement with the Portuguese, get some concessions, get some things out of the Portuguese, and agree to be baptized and things like that, and set up this temporary peace with the Portuguese. But in 1624, when her brother dies, she becomes queen, and she decides to take over the neighboring kingdom of Matamba. She makes herself an ally with the Dutch, who are the enemy of the Portuguese, and she would fight, right, with the Portuguese for a long time. She becomes queen in 1624. Right up until about 1650 is when Ndongo and Anamazingo are at war, and they finally negotiate peace. She would go on to rebuild and strengthen the territory, but it is one of the important stories of resistance to the Portuguese in Africa during this time period. So this is going to necessarily fall under an external resistance, because this is not resistance that comes by way of someone inside of Portugal or people who are from Portugal, right? This is an indigenous population fighting back against colonization of the Portuguese. And ultimately in 1650, they are successful at driving them back. All right. Now, I know we've also been focusing a lot on European powers and European empires, but I want you to remember that we also have other empires as well. So in Unit 3, we talked about the Mughal Empire and their expansion into India. We talked about Akbar, who reigned during 1556 to 1605, who expands the Mughal Empire across northern India and takes measures to get support from the Hindus, because the Mughals are Muslim, and most of India is predominantly Hindu. So he repeals the jizya tax. He abolishes the jizya tax. If we remember the jizya tax, that's a tax on non-Muslim citizens. So anyone who's not Muslim would have to normally pay the government a tax. He repeals that. He gets rid of it. And he puts Hindu officials in government. So again, all to get the support of the Hindus, right? So kind of to refresh your memory from Unit 3. When we get to Aurangzeb in 1658, and we did also talk about Aurangzeb as well, there's this general policy of religious intolerance. He puts back the jizya tax. He destroys Hindu temples. He removes non-Muslims from government. So this starts the set of resistance and rebellion from the Hindus, particularly the Marathas. The Marathas, you see their empire kind of listed there in purple, would eventually go to war as well. From 1680 to 1707, the Marathas kind of push back against the Mughals. They maintain their control of their territory. You have Sambhaji down here on the bottom right of the slide, who leads those resistance efforts. So this conflict with the Marathas and internal conflict that face the Mughals brings an end to the Mughal control over India. So this is a set of internal resistance, because not only are we necessarily seeing them fight with an empire, the Marathas also kind of exist within the Mughal Empire. And the Mughals also face resistance from inside by the Hindus. So this is internal resistance that the Mughal Empire faces with their people. So the next rebellion that we're going to talk about here is the Cossack Rebellion. Okay, so if we remember back to Europe in the late 1400s, early 1500s, we had talked about feudalism. We've talked about how conditions would ultimately eventually improve for the serfs who live in Europe. That does not happen here in Russia. Now, we haven't spent too much time talking about Russia in this class, but well, suffice to say here, conditions do not improve for the serfs as they had in Europe. So there's a power shift from the monarchy, from the king and the Tsars and the Tsaress of Russia, to the nobles, the rich, and the conditions of the serfs worsen, right? The serfs get themselves into more and more debt. Some of them feel the only option for them is to escape and live with the Cossacks, right? The definition for the Cossacks is here on the left of the slide. Cossacks are freemen, right? People who've escaped feudalism in Russia. Some of them become warriors. Some of them become mercenaries, right? Soldiers for hire. They live near the Black Sea, which is kind of where modern day Ukraine is. They are semi-autonomous, right? They earn some of that privilege to govern themselves by fighting for Russia. So that's kind of where they get some of their power. And Catherine the Great, who is the Tsaress of Russia at the time, she decides to kind of solidify this noble support by giving the nobles the power over the peasants. And that causes a lot of unrest. There are upwards of 50 peasant revolts that take place during Catherine the Great's reign. And ultimately, the one we're going to talk about here in particular is the Pugachev Revolution, the Pugachev Rebellion in 1774. Pugachev was a Cossack who gained a large following. We'll talk a little bit more about how in just a second. But he recruits the serfs, he recruits the Cossacks, he recruits factory workers and priests, right? This wide set of people from within Russia. And his efforts are not taken seriously by Catherine the Great. And she later realizes that he is a real challenge to her power and her authority, and she will kind of work to squash this rebellion. Okay. Now, the peasants and the Cossack rebellions during Catherine the Great's reign in Russia culminate in this rebellion. Yemelyan Pugachev is a former soldier from within Catherine the Great's army. He gets support from the peasants and the Cossacks, most interestingly, by impersonating Tsar Peter III, who was overthrown by his wife, right? So her husband, Catherine, right? He kind of pretends to be Peter the Great. Peter had been killed, by the way. But he pretends to be someone who is Peter the Third. He had accepted his dethronement, that he was no longer Tsar of Russia, but wants to rise up against Catherine and defeat her. And this impersonation actually works well, right? I want you to understand that, like, we don't have pictures, we don't have the internet, we don't have social media at this point. So this impersonation of Tsar Peter works really well because he does kind of look like him a little bit, maybe a little bit disheveled version of Tsar Peter. And so it works really, really well, right? Because there was all this mystery around the death of Peter III. So he's able to take advantage of that mystery and that distrust. So he gathers up his army, right? The Cossacks, the serfs, everyone that he's gathered up to support him. He takes over the city of Kazan, which is east of Moscow. And in the rebellion, there's so much success because Catherine doesn't take him seriously. And in 1774, she finally realizes, right? So a whole year later, she finally realizes that this is a significant threat to her power, and she takes measures against Pugachev. He's ultimately betrayed by some of his own people. He is captured and executed publicly in Moscow in January of 1775, and that ends the Pugachev rebellion against Catherine the Great. Now, notice here, this is internal conflict as well, internal conflict and internal resistance as well. This is from within Russia. Pugachev takes advantage of the feelings of the peasants. He uses the Cossacks to his advantage. So this is internal. This is not something that comes from outside of Russia. This is a challenge to Catherine the Great from inside of Russia. Now, the next resistance that we'll talk about is the Fronde civil disturbances in France. Now, these Fronde is the French word for sling, and these disturbances are given that name because slings were used to propel rocks through the windows of their opposition, like quite literally slingshots. Okay. Now, these civil disturbances take place from 1648 to 1653 and are sparked by resistance of the French nobility, which is led by Prince de Conde and the Duke of Beaufort, to the policies of the chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin, who effectively ruled France in the king's name. We'll talk a little bit more about Mazarin. We'll talk more about the king at the time when we get into the French Revolution in Unit 5. But the Fronde revolts include lower classes, urban lower classes, people in the city, some of the peasants who joined the rebellion against high taxes and food shortages. The wars would ultimately end with the rebel forces being defeated, which kind of solidified the absolute power of the monarchy in France, which lays the foundation for King Louis XIV, who we will talk about later on in Unit 5 when we get into the French Revolution. But again, notice here, this is an example of internal conflict, internal resistance. These are people from within France who are fighting back against some form of their government, some form of the state. Right? So the next one that we'll move into now takes us back to the Americas. We'll talk about Metacom's War here, and I'm going to kind of move myself a little bit out of the way because I notice I'm covering some of the words here, but I'll move myself back so you can look at the image here. This is a challenge to state authority in the Americas. Now, this is also referred to not only as Metacom's War, but also as King Philip's War. It's an an armed conflict between the indigenous inhabitants of New England and the New England colonists. Right? Remember that the Dutch and the English set up colonies here in what is now the United States. These take place from 1675 to 1676. Um, there had been resistance before. I want to point that out, right? The Native Americans who lived here did push back against European colonists before this particular conflict. But Metacom's War is kind of the final major pushback against English colonists from the indigenous Wampanoag people. The Wampanoag Indian tribe or Native American tribe, it's kind of their final push to get the English out of the region. Now, the war is named after Chief Metacom of the Wampanoag people. He's later known as King Philip, and this is the 14-month bloody rebellion that he leads against the English. It begins as a result of this increasing set of tension, increasing set of hostilities between the colonists and the Native Americans, who are losing their land and their resources because of the expanding settlements of the English. The war is really devastating for both sides. A lot of villages and towns are completely destroyed. There's a significant number of casualties for both sides, lots of deaths, but the English ultimately win against the Wampanoag. The war, though, has a huge impact on the region as a whole. It leads to the decline of Native American power and the consolidation of English control over New England. You had lots of smaller tribes who joined in with the Wampanoag, the Nipmunks, the Podanks, the Narshe, the Wabanakis, and then there were also some Native American groups who sided with the English, right? The Mohegans, the Pequots, the Mohawks, they sided with the English. But this is internal resistance, internal within the colony, right? Yes, the Native Americans don't exist within the colony itself, but they live here. So this is internal resistance within the colony, but ultimately, again, a devastating war with the Wampanoag tribe against the English colonists. Okay. Staying in the Americas, we'll take a look at the Pueblo Revolt now. This is an uprising against the Spanish in their province of Santa Fe de New Mexico. Okay. The Pueblos and their allies rising up against the Spanish. Ultimately, this revolt would only kill about 400 Spanish settlers, driving the rest of them out of of the region, right? It seems to be a victory for the Pueblo people, but in 1680, this revolt begins. One of the major driving factors is religion. Right? The Spanish had consistently tried to convert natives to Christianity, and throughout that process, they threatened anyone who was trying to practice their native religion. And in 1675, the Spanish arrested 47 medicine men of the Pueblo people who were practicing sorcery, right, or witchcraft, right? But 3 of those 47 people were executed. 1 of them committed suicide, and the others were whipped and jailed in public. So one of those who was jailed was Pope. Pope was released when the Spanish were occupied in a conflict with the Apache Indians. And Pope would go on to lead this revolt against the Spanish, killing 400 of them, and then that would drive the rest of them to leave Santa Fe. 12 years later, though, the Spanish would come back in 1692, and they would reconquer this territory of what is today New Mexico and parts of Colorado. So this is internal conflict to the Spanish colony, right? The Spanish had taken over this area. They had tried to convert the Pueblo and integrate them into Spanish society. So this is internal conflict within the colony. Now, moving into talking about rebellions with enslaved people. All right. In 1739, you have the Stono Rebellion. This takes place in the British colony of South Carolina. The rebellion was led by a group of enslaved Africans who killed several plantation owners and attempted to march themselves to Florida, where they thought they would get freedom. If you remember from topic 4, Unit 4, topic 4, Fort Mose in St. Augustine was established by the Spanish as the first black settlement. Spanish Florida had a policy of freeing any slave who escaped from British colonies in the north. So that is why these slaves from South Carolina are trying to make it to trying to make it to Florida. The rebellion gets its name from the Stono River, which is kind of where the meeting takes place to kind of discuss the plans. But South Carolina had such a huge population of slaves that at times the colonists had trouble keeping things in line. And eventually this rebellion is put down by the white colonial forces. The leaders, many of the participants are captured, executed, and killed. But it is a significant rebellion because it was one of the largest and most violent uprisings of enslaved people in the British colonies in North America before the Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary War, which we'll talk about later in Unit 5, is the largest uprising. But it is something that leads to stricter slave codes, stricter laws in South Carolina, which make it more difficult for enslaved people to rebel or escape. Right? So much more strict laws that are put in place afterwards. But again, an attempt here internally, these are enslaved people who live internally within the colony, who are rising up and rebelling against this state, right? Rebelling against the British in this part of the world. Next, we'll take a look here at what are called maroon societies. So giving you a little bit of background here. Slaves in the Americas that had escaped slavery would join communities that were known as maroons. These are groups of people, former slaves, who sometimes joined together with some of the indigenous people to set up communities in territory that was really not very favorable to live in, right? In inhospitable terrain. But in doing so and setting themselves up in places that people most likely don't want to live or could live, they feel that they can set themselves up to keep their freedom, avoid capture. Because remember, punishment for any escaped slave is very harsh. And these societies, these maroon societies, existed all throughout the Americas, anywhere that slavery existed. Florida had a maroon settlement made up of former African slaves that joined forces with the Seminole tribe. In Haiti, you had escaped slaves who retreated to maroons in the mountainous territory, and later Haiti would experience a huge slave revolt led by a maroon leader. You had maroon settlements in Brazil as well in the 1600s that have over 30,000 people who live in it and had their own king, King Zumbi, who is here on the screen. And in Jamaica, you have actual wars that take place known as the Maroon Wars, which are what we're going to talk about in particular. So make sure that you know what a Maroon society is or who Maroons are. Maroons are escaped slaves in the Americas that form their own settlements. And so these are the people that we're going to talk about in their wars. So let's talk about the Maroon Wars. And we're going to focus a lot of our time here on the first Maroon War. But there are two Maroon Wars that are fought between the Jamaican Maroons and the colonial British forces. The first taking place from 1728 to 1740. The second one from 1795 to 1796. Again, the focus is going to be the first. So tensions rise in Jamaica and leads to open conflict between the Windward Maroon settlement in the Blue Mountains, which are located in the center of the island, and the new British governor. The Maroons would resort to what's called guerrilla tactics, and that was an aim to weaken the British despite them having fewer numbers than the British and fewer supplies than the British. Now, there was a woman by the name of Nani of the Maroons, and her picture is there on the bottom right of the slide. She's an expert at this kind of tactic. So in 1739, finally, the British government realizes that they can't defeat the Maroons after years and years of guerrilla war. Guerrilla war means you're sort of finding a place like you see on the slide, right? Coming upon soldiers in the woods, or we now sort of see guerrilla tactics in city warfare, right? But the British government realizes that they can't defeat the Maroons. They are coming up against this resistance. The wars drag on for years, right? Years and years of conflict, nearly 20 years of conflict. And so they ultimately sign a peace treaty with the Maroons and the British government. that says, that the Maroons kind of have their space, but they need this particular group of Maroons, the Windwards, have to recognize that slavery exists on the island of Jamaica. Now, the Second Maroon War involves a different group of Maroons, right? And the Windward Maroons stay neutral because they have a peace treaty. But the Second Maroon War in Jamaica results in the surrender of the Maroons themselves. The image here on the slide you can see is heavily forested mountain terrain where the Maroons operated, right, trying to bring in the soldiers and fighting against them. This is kind of the conflict of the guerrilla conflict, okay? But this is, again, internal conflict. These are people who lived within the British colony of Jamaica, right? Even though they are enslaved Africans who had escaped and tried to set up their own society, right? They are within the colony, so it is internal conflict. Right? All right. So this next section is particularly for my AP classes, right? We're going to talk about, in my AP class, we're going to talk about context. Context is putting a situation in which something exists or happens and can help explain it. So my pre-AP students, you can move on from this one. Okay, but my AP students, we're going to do this together in class. So keep an eye out for that. You can leave it blank for now, but we'll move into that in class together. So here are the things that are important for you to review out of topic 4.4 and make sure that you have a good understanding, right? How, as state power grows in this period, how it results in various forms of resistance. So make sure you have an understanding of Ana Nzinga's resistance to Portugal, the resistance of the Marathas to the Mughals in Southeast Asia, the Cossacks and how they are used in Pugachev's rebellion in Russia, the Fronde Civil War in France, which again, we'll talk a little bit more about again when we get into revolutions in Unit 5. Metacom's War, the Pueblo Revolt, the Stoner Rebellion that happened in North America, and the establishment of the Maroon Societies and the Maroon Wars in Jamaica. So make sure you have a good understanding of all of these as you finish out this section. Okay, that's all for topic 6. You can move forward to topic 7 if you're ready. And if you have questions, of course, let me know.